Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, welcome back to the Rabbit Holes That Quack, episode number 2. You're mostly related to today's documentary, Hysterical podcast. I am one of your hosts, Brandan Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the woman, the myth, the quack on stage, Miss Nicole Matthews.
Hello, listeners.
And if you are just joining us well into the future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Nicole and I subject ourselves to a random documentary every week and let that be the springboard for a larger conversation about the issues therein. If you'd like to drop a particular documentary into the hat for us to choose from, we'll be choosing them from amongst our patrons at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack, where you can also submit broader topics, comments, and questions for both this and our other sister podcast, such as The Movies That Quack, where co-host Wade Slicken and I put each other on the spot each week to ask each other Hollywood's most poignant and stupid questions about what we think will happen next, as well as The Conversations That Quack, where co-host Efren Garcia and I do a weekly deep dive into the issues facing the Black movie protagonist. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a Patreon of any one of our tiers that start as low as $1, which includes early access to all of Pandora's Quack's podcast. But if that's not in the cards for you right now, that's more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. And so, listeners, without further ado, these are the rabbit holes that quack. Hysterical is an honest and hilarious backstage pass into the lives of some of stand-up comedy's most boundary-breaking women, exploring the hard-fought journey to become the voices of their generation and their gender. It was directed by Andrea Nevins, who is known for her documentary Tiny Shoulders, Rethinking Barbie, which sounds kind of interesting. And as of this recording, Hysterical currently sits at an 88% critical Rotten Tomatoes rating with a 75% audience score. So another one that's actually pretty high. Much like last time, I will try to start off, Nicole, with sort of the pre-documentary. We'll call this the controversial question as we kind of go on our journey here. The first question, of course, with zero context, interpret it as you will. Are women funny?
Oh, God, I cannot believe that you have the nerve to ask me that. Of course women are funny. Are you kidding me? I actually happen to think in certain circumstances, women are funnier than men. Just because I believe we tap in on a different emotional wavelength than I think men are capable of sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I think women are more consistently funny and more funny in real life, if that makes sense. You know, like I know a lot of funny women. I don't know a lot of funny men.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I was thinking about before the documentary, and there's only really one direct sort of mention of that question, and it's kind of a preposterous question because it's just like, oh, are women funny? Yes. And then I was like, yeah, but like, what is that like nagging, you know, something that says that that's not true? Because it's like, there are plenty of, exactly as you just said, there are people in person that are just quite funny. There are a lot of famous writers and kind of improv folks and all this kind of stuff. And the conclusion that I actually really came to is I was like, it's something about stand-up in particular that when you say, are women funny or are women stand-up comics funny, for some reason there's this cloud on it. And that was kind of how I sat down to like watch this documentary, because I was like, oh, there's got to be some sort of weird it's not like, in my opinion at least, not as plain as like a very like sexist sort of thing, of which obviously that's present. But I was like, in the same way that people have those like Mandela effects or something, I was like, there's something here that is making us all believe this, even though we all have fun, like friends that are really funny. We all have this. And so it was pretty fascinating. And the only really two people in particular, I know like you and I have talked about these two, and kind of the conclusion that I came to is that, at least for me personally, when it becomes very clear that Hollywood or like show business is trying to tell us who's funny, I feel like that's when it sort of gets very incendiary, and then all the kind of, crazies on the extreme kind of fringes kind of come out. The two examples that I was thinking of was Amy Schumer and Leslie Jones. Both of them have their, just followings like any kind of stand-up does. But I think when it felt like Amy Schumer, who has had her great show on Comedy Central, which I think I saw a few episodes of, was sort of just being pushed to the front and center, and was kind of like we were being told she is the next kind of thing. I think that's where there's a lot of like friction sort of with her. And she's done some like cool stand-up that I do appreciate. But then what you and I have talked about with Leslie Jones, I go, her stand-up is really funny, and there's something weird about whenever they put her in a movie that I think they just don't give her either the room to improvise, or it's just like a terrible script or something, but she just never really comes off as funny as she is when she's just riffing on stuff that she's seen. But it was just an interesting question that I was curious to lob over your way.
Yes, I think that was an illuminating description of the patriarchy. I completely agree. That cloud is really tough for us to get rid of.
Yeah. What were your expectations heading into this? Obviously you kind of found out about a week ago. You may have seen some trailers or sort of heard about, some stuff, but like knowing you're going to watch a documentary as you sit down about female stand-up comics, what was sort of your expectations going in?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I guess I kind of immediately started to think about who they might feature in the documentary, and like whether it would be, just focused on, I guess, what you could say sort of like the top of the top, like the Amy Schumers, or whether it would be more of like, kind of the middle layer. So I was a little bit intrigued about that. But I kind of suspected that it would likely point at some of the themes that it did, just because I follow loosely kind of some of the things that have been happening in that world. And so some of the things that appeared in the documentary were things I were kind of already aware of.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just worried that it was going to be too much of a woe is me sort of situation. I haven't really, the only thing I really had in context to compare it to is really only those like micro docs that they do at the start and kind of maybe sometimes at the end of when we like watch like stand-up comedy specials. And they don't really tell you anything. It's really just sort of like them hanging out. But this was released, I think it's a Hulu exclusive. It may be also on demand, but released in 2021. So I kind of presumed it would have some Me Too stuff in it. And it was kind of like, oh, I hope this isn't too much of a, this is why we can't sort of thing. And to sort of provide just a larger context of which I thought that it did a great job doing. So to that point, now that we can kind of dive in, what did you think about Hysterical as a documentary? Did it seem fair? Did it seem biased? What were your kind of initial impressions when the credits rolled here?
Yeah, I think, I really enjoyed it for sure. I thought it was a really great peek sort of into that world, into the challenges that women face. And I agree, it didn't come across to me as kind of have sympathy for us. I think it was more just trying to bring awareness to the reality that it is a very male-dominated industry, and that a lot of the women that, have seen success, it hasn't come without its share of challenges and trauma. But I think, in kind of showcasing that, also showcasing how common those experiences are amongst women. And I think for me, that was sort of some of the most interesting kind of parts of the documentary, was a lot of the discussion around comedians really being, sort of a reflection of what's happening in society, and, the struggles that, people are facing. So yeah, I thought, I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah, same. I actually think that ironically, there's and I definitely won't remember listeners a lot of the names that are kind of involved in this, but there is one woman who was talking about how she had a all-female show, and she didn't say anything about that. She just kind of like let it be, and everyone sort of enjoyed themselves. And I almost, to a certain degree, there are obviously specific topics in this documentary, but I almost think it's a disservice to almost kind of say that's what it's about, because I actually do think it was a really great look at the profession, which I wasn't expecting and was like really like happy about, actually, because I don't know that I've seen that broadly, and obviously kind of not from the quote unquote male perspective, but I just really appreciated how it was like, this is something that not only if you wanted to get into, these are the types of backgrounds of people who go into this, and kind of just the general struggles, whether you're male or female, of just sort of paying your dues and all that kind of stuff. And I think that Andrea Nevins, it actually kind of made me kind of think, oh, okay, I might actually check out her other doc that I mentioned up top, the Barbie one. But I just liked how it did that. I liked how it kind of approached the history. I would have just never, it's not something that I followed beyond the curated stuff that you get from like a Pandora or like Apple comedy station. But it was really cool to see. I kept actually, it's funny. It almost seems like a glaring omission. I kept waiting to see like Lucille Ball here. I have no idea. I don't know if she ever did stand up. I think she was just a comedic sort of actor, but I kind of was expecting her to sort of show up. But it was cool to see in black and white these like women who are also doing like on those kind of talk shows and doing that stuff like way back then, and sort of being up on stage and sort of making everyone laugh. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I grew up with sort of this awareness of some of these women, Joan Rivers, Kathy Griffin, Margaret Cho. And I think like for me, they always were really memorable characters for a lot of the reasons that they discussed, earlier comedians had an impact on them. I think can be shocking sometimes as a woman to see another woman speak in that way, just because of how we are sometimes conditioned to behave in society. So for me, it was just really interesting to see, really people that I kind of grew up looking up to in a sense, just because they were these examples of, I'm going to say this really shocking thing and get away with it, or I'm going to say, sort of just the things that I think at least like, for my generation, for sure, still really weren't like talked about, certain topics were still things that would just be kind of, either hush hush, or you would talk about it just with girlfriends, but not like in a wider context. And so I think for me, it was kind of cool to go back, even further in time, and really see some of those very early female comics that inspired, the Joan Rivers and the Kathy Griffins of the world. So I think that part was really fascinating. And I think, to your point too, it did a good job of just sort of giving a peek of like in general what it's like to be a comedian. I think some of the scenes I really enjoyed, like at the Comedy Cellar, where they're just all kind of sitting around having a meal together, and sort of just that general camaraderie that they do have, as comedians, male or female. But I think that being said, the documentary definitely did have a very clear point of view and lens in terms of specifically focusing in on women. And I think, one of the things that I really enjoyed was sort of these markers that happened across the documentary, where they would bring up, a certain term like, confidence or stage time or going on the road, and provide sort of this standard definition of, what those things mean. And then a secondary and tertiary definition of what it actually means for a woman. And I think that framing was really, really well done throughout. And a lot of those definitions really kind of made me smile, because I felt like I could almost anticipate each time what the definition was going to be for a woman. And so I think that was just really interesting and created some really nice signposting kind of throughout the film.
Yeah, that reminded me of the story where Marina Franklin, one of the Black comedians, and she was saying they're sitting at the table and she's kind of retelling the story of how dangerous it was when she went to stay at this like hotel, and she was like, you told me it was safe, and they're all kind of sitting there, and he kind of tells his side of just like, oh, when he was staying there, it was a good place to sort of, have women sort of come back, and like one of the other women who's sitting at the table was just like, yeah, you know, it's good for like bringing dates back or for getting pancakes. You're always sort of about the food. And then he kind of finally, like by the end of that story, was sort of like, yeah, I mean, there was a meth addict that was like sort of there. So I guess it really wasn't sort of that safe. And it's like interesting because it's one of those things where it's sort of it's like, do these two things cancel each other out? On the one side of the coin, just a terrible hotel. Like, it's kind of one of those things where it's just like, who is staying there? Why are people staying there? That's just like a ridiculous sort of situation for that to just sort of be like the go-to. Oh yeah, like that's where you stay when you sort of perform there. And then sort of on the other side, it's like, but that's also kind of like what I guess these comedians sort of like do. There's even, I think, a scene towards the end where they're kind of like, oh yeah, like I stayed at this like, you know, like Holiday Inn, or, you know, they just name these sort of like motel and whatever sort of things. And it's like kind of one of those, like those things where you go, yeah, it's not that obviously you think of comedy as a dangerous profession. It's like one of those like weird, dumb on the road. So you're staying here and you're staying here and you're staying here things. But then there is obviously the layer of complexity of being a woman and being sort of alone in that city and kind of being that accessible in like a motel where just like, you know, the door opens up to just wherever sort of thing. And it's one of those things where like I kind of wonder about sometimes. And actually, again, like why I thought the documentary did a really good job of not like mentioning it in like the appropriate context and having us hear it like firsthand, but it wasn't like, oh, this is a major problem. It's just, it's kind of like one of those things where it was like, oh, this is just, by the way, this is just something that like we also have to deal with that you guys might not realize, sort of thing. And I just appreciated that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read that in a different way because in my mind, women are always in danger. Like, I don't disagree with you that the nature of their job obviously puts them on the road and puts them into different situations. But I think the documentary actually kind of highlighted this in like two of my favorite bits. I think one in which the woman was joking around kind of rejecting a man's offer to go down by the river because she had to carry her vagina with her. And then Wanda Sykes' very hilarious bit about, wouldn't it just be great if we could leave our pussies at home? And so I think that to me, what those bits really are getting at, it's like, it's not just female comics that are in danger in this world. It is all women. And I think that's why that joke is so funny, because as a woman, that is a very enticing concept. You know, I think Wanda Sykes' bit in particular was about doing it so that she could go running at night, right? Yeah. And you and I have talked about this, I think, at great length over the years, just in terms of men and women navigate the world in terms of safety in very different ways, right? And, you know, I think it's definitely a distinction, obviously, between men and women. I think you can also argue it's a distinction between different races as well. So this is a factor in our society, but I think for the purpose of this discussion, you know, focusing specifically on men and women, there are just a lot of things that women cannot do in this world currently, either without a great deal of thought, preparation, you know, letting others know. And I think that, you know, yes, these women definitely are at a higher risk, but I really did appreciate sort of just highlighting and the representation that they do actually of just what it is like to be a woman in the world, period, regardless of being a female comic. There is just certain realities that we have, you know, been confronted with for a really long time and that continue to be really prevalent in our society. And I think, you know, that's to a certain extent what Me Too was about, you know, but I really strongly believe we still live in a society that does hate women. And I think we see a lot of that also shine through in the documentary when it comes to things like vanity and a lot of the stuff that Eliza talks about, who I think is just hilarious, by the way. I know you and I have watched a couple of her specials together, but just sort of the insecurity that is bred into women, you know, from such an early age. You know, that to me is like another form of feeling unsafe because we feel unsafe in our own bodies. So it starts internally from a very young age. And then there's all of the sort of external threats that you continue to face as you become, you know, a grown woman. And so I think for me, a lot of that in the documentary really hit home because I think it is something that most women will find very relatable.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought along those lines that was pretty interesting is, you have a lot of the things and the kind of the points that you just made, sort of juxtaposed up against, there's sort of this segment of the documentary they're talking about where women sort of just don't help other women. And it was something that sort of like I thought about, because it was like, there's this thing that I think that happens, again, kind of putting some of the kind of, I think the comment that you just made not too long ago, putting, the racial sort of stuff aside, politics and all that kind of stuff. There does seem to be this like, oh, I'm a guy, and they see a guy coming up, and like, there's sort of this like, oh, cool, I can take you under my wing and like show you the ropes, and like, yeah, this is kind of how you do it. Oh, okay, like you should open for me, and like that kind of thing that just always has seemed to be built in, called like, not even so much for comedy, just like from like a societal sort of perspective. And it was interesting to hear them sort of talk about how like there was always this competition that they were kind of always sort of vying for each other. And there were like, obvious reasons for that, with like the woman who talks about like, oh, they've told us to our face that you can't go like, two guys, or rather two women in a row, like that'll just, everyone will go crazy sort of thing. But it's like one of those things where I do wonder, both in the specific context of this documentary and comedy, and then just broadly, if that mentality of bringing people up was more prevalent, or just sort of built in or baked in or whatever, if some of the things that do quote unquote sort of hold women back wouldn't be there. Like, it's almost like everyone's kind of operating as though they don't have a tribe, and yet they do. You're kind of half of the population. Like, there are other people out there doing what you're doing. And it seemed like, for the most part, like Eliza's generation-ish was like far more willing to sort of look down, or that's like not so much the phrase, but like sort of like look back rather, and kind of be like, oh, hey, like that's someone. I think she had kind of had that story where she was like, oh, the woman who basically was on stage and kind of called out Harvey Weinstein in the middle of the room. She was like, oh, like that's actually changed the way that I think about certain things and how I might be able to sort of approach things. And like they may, probably, I think she said she even like reached out to her sort of thing. And then even sort of the Kathy Griffin instance where like, they kind of, Amy Schumer and sort of the others had kind of sent her that the video kind of thing to say like, hey, like we're out there, like we support you kind of thing. But it was just interesting to hear that, because I do think on the male side, you do kind of hear this, oh, hey, like I had always been a fan of Eddie Murphy or Richard Pryor, or I'd always been a, Kevin Hart or something like that. And I was able to sort of like get into their orbit. And really Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish, I think, are the only, call it male to female, at least as public. I'm sure, it probably happens on a smaller scale, but that was kind of like, oh, hey, I see that you're funny. Hey, like, let me reach my hand back and let me kind of show you sort of the ropes. And I just found that fascinating, that doesn't seem to be a thing that happens on the female side. Yet they're all kind of aware of it.
Yeah, but I think, again, like my response to that is going to once again be the patriarchy. I think, the reality is that like from my perspective, women have been forced into that kind of behavior, and I think they kind of address that, right? Is like, what else do you expect to happen when there's one slot that a woman at a comedy club is going to be given for that night? It's really hard to induce any sort of other feelings or vibes towards the other women competing for that spot when there's one spot, right? And I think that like that is kind of the position that women have been in forever, and I thought it was really interesting though that they did highlight sort of like the turn that did shift for them after Me Too in sort of banding together, kind of to your point that there's this power, I think, in women coming together. And, even now, like that can be a really popular platform for, celebrities and politicians and the like to take. But I think there are a few that really do that in an authentic way now, in terms of actually sort of really servicing that, like really actually standing for bringing women together, being someone that does not need to put another woman down in order to feel better about themselves, But I think that what was interesting about the documentary is a lot of these women were also very raw and vulnerable in saying how hard that is to do, And I think like it comes down, I think, to like how you were raised and the tools you were given, you know, but I think sometimes insecurity is just one of those things that a lot of women are unable to sort of stamp out. And I think when you sort of look out at, you know, whatever realities they might be facing from a work perspective, you know, which is in this case is we're only going to pick one of you for this slot, or even just the reflections of themselves as like I think Eliza talks about in a lot of her acts, of what women see sort of in the media, you know, these messages that are constantly sort of bombarding us with, you're so pretty, but you need to lose 10 pounds, you know, as she said, like it's a very constant mixed message. And I think, you know, I have no judgment actually of a lot of women that struggle with sort of these issues. It's hard for me because sometimes these are the women that then are not so nice to other women. But I understand it, you know, I understand where that comes from and how that continues to be perpetuated in our society because of factors that are out of our control.
Yeah, maybe it's just like a generational, it's not immaturity, but maybe it's just a generational like perspective, because I remember listening to a podcast not too long ago, or re-listening, I should say. I think it's probably from a couple of years ago. And it was about, I don't think it was Felicia Rashad, the woman who played Bill Cosby's wife on the Cosby Show. I think it was like her sister or something like that. And she's like a famous choreographer for doing a lot of stuff. And the interviewer asked her, she was like, hey, like when you guys were going out for plays back then, was there a lot of competition? And she was like, no, absolutely not. She's like, you have to understand, like, it was literally going to be one of the six of us kind of thing. And so we banded together and we basically kind of like helped each other and we like ran lines for each other. And we were kind of like, oh, I hope it's going to be like, if it's not me, then it's you. And like, that's awesome because like us as a group are like pushing it forward. And so it's just interesting to me to like hear you say that kind of like from a perspective, obviously like just, you know, reacting sort of what's in the documentary, but just like hearing that's not an uncommon sentiment that people have today where they kind of just go, well, of course, like it's sort of an external force. And so it's an interesting thing. Just two ideas in my head to sort of juxtapose as like, there is a version where there's a marginalized group that goes, well, all right, like let's do this thing. And then there's another marginalized group that kind of just goes, well, we can't because of external forces. Just kind of an interesting sort of psychology of it.
Well, and I think, you know, to be clear, I think there are a myriad of examples of women coming together, like in present day society. There's, you know, amazing social clubs that exist for women and different organizations and things like that. So it's not like we haven't like cracked this nut. Like, I think we've figured it out. And I think even as this documentary shows, these comedians have finally figured out that, you know, as I think they said quite plainly, they can earn more money when they stick together. You know, the example they gave about Amy Schumer's show and how much she continued to pull in women. I think when I talk about these external factors, I simply mean that a lot of these things continue to exist in a way that make it hard for women to actually move past some of these barriers, I think, in liking each other. And I think a lot of these comedians did talk about that their own insecurities sort of come out, you know, their own thoughts of like, am I pretty, you know, as much as they all sort of want to quiet those thoughts, they can't all the time, right? And I think those are sometimes the thoughts that then lead to things like jealousy of other women, animosity towards other women, you know, because you're feeling insecure about something that you might not have and another woman has it. And that's just a reason to sort of dislike her. And I think, you know, a lot of that is sort of driven by what society tells us. You know, even the example of the comedian who grew up with like the prettier sister, you know, that's likely a concept that she kind of saw because of what she was, you know, watching, what sort of the world around her was telling her about beauty and about, you know, why looks matter, essentially. Right. So I think that's really more what I mean. I think, you know, we have proven that we can band together, and use that, you know, to our advantage. I just think that certain things, until they change, will make it difficult for women to come together as one harmonious collective.
Yeah, one of the things that I did find fascinating was the backgrounds of a lot of them, because I think I've heard most like when you know you hear like a male comedian sort of being interviewed, there's always sort of this half joking, half serious, like they're like, oh yeah, it's just depression, it's just a pain, it's just my way of sort of like dealing with things. And it was actually really cool to see how all these women have actually like very eclectic backgrounds. Like it was sort of one of those things where like there's definitely the archetype of like either just the class clown or, you know, that kind of thing. And I think only maybe like one or two of them were like that person. And it was kind of just like, some of them were just sort of like, I think Sherry Shepherd, she's one that was sort of like, yeah, I was just kind of like funny. And then she went to go do, I think it was like some secretary job, and then ended up quitting and kind of like putting a lot of time in sort of like developing her craft. And like, you know, she's sort of someone that I would say almost everyone that they have in here, I didn't necessarily know their names right off, but I was like, oh yeah, I've seen your like thumbnail or like you in like a sizzle reel or something for like Netflix or something of that nature. But it was, I thought that was actually like really cool to see. And like, yeah, I think you were talking about like Nikki Glasser, who is like, had her sister. I was laughing about that because I was like, and they're going to say like her sister's like Mila Kunis or something like that. And I was going to be like, oh yeah, I wonder whatever like happened to her. And it's not even like the subject of like the documentary, but I was like, oh, she ended up being whoever sort of thing. But yeah, it was cool. I really liked, Fortune Feimster's, her sort of like story because
me too,
because like, I think the thing that like one of the reasons I really liked hers almost above, you know, almost far and above with everyone else was because it was like one of those things where like she, to your point about insecurities, kind of like knew that and then kind of had like made peace with it. Like it was like, well, yeah, I kind of like, you know, sort of the joke that she was making about like the pantsuits and all that kind of stuff. It was almost like she became self-aware very, very early on to like realize that it's like, yes, I'm a gay woman that looks like this. That's like a little bit, you know, definitely sort of just away from, you know, as you were saying, sort of the societal definition of beauty kind of thing. And so like, this is just, you know, like if you're going to come at me and like say stuff, like I don't really have like a reaction to that. Like, it's like, yeah, kind of thing. And then she sort of like tells her jokes sort of thing. Then I said that was like really fascinating, kind of the story that she has with her mom. And then it was like, conversely, you have like Margaret Cho, who like, I'd almost completely forgotten about that. Like, I think I remember her show being on, and I kind of have to assume I've like seen like episodes of it. Like I have like vague memories of like watching it, but like nothing like too specific. And like how she was saying, like it took her a while to kind of just find that piece, to kind of like get to the point where it was like, oh, okay, like my looks and like this is just not something that like, yes, I'm dealing with it, but it's no longer eating away at me in such a way that, you know, it used to when I was younger, sort of thing. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think, you know, it is one of those things, again, where I just feel like every woman is kind of on her own journey with that. And I do think that there's a lot of factors that play into it, for sure. And I think, like, you know, personally, I've always felt blessed, I think, in a sense of just not struggling with confidence issues. I mean, that's not to say that I, you know, don't sometimes have insecurities. But I think for whatever reason, you know, maybe it's all credit to my mother. Maybe it's just environmental things in terms of where I grew up. Just never felt that like pressure to be someone else. Like it just felt fine to be me. And like, that was okay, you know, and not that I had like some like false, you know, sense of attractiveness or something, but more just sort of, you know, I think as like a couple of the comedians talked about, just comfortable with myself, you know. But I've always felt really grateful for that. I think for a lot of the reasons that these comedians talked about, right? It's like, to your point, Margaret Cho didn't get to feel that peace in herself until like she was 40, right? And I think like that really struck me as well, because I more or less have felt that peace my whole life. And I think that it does just sort of, again, illuminate for me how much women unfortunately do have to struggle with that. And it makes me really sad. Like, it's a gift I wish that just all women could be given, because I think it frees up, you know, your mind for other things and other focuses, you know? And I have friends that, like, you know, I sometimes think can be like deeply insecure to their own detriment. And it's really hard to watch sometimes, you know? And I do think that something a lot of the comedians highlighted in the documentary, like, and there was that one funny bit about what men see when they look in the mirror, is just that I don't think men deal with this in the same way that women do. I don't know men as many women as I know where like they deal with deep insecurities about their looks. And then I think the other unfortunate thing too, and they address this with this one young comedian, I think coming up to one of the more seasoned comedians, is that women don't just experience this in terms of their looks. We then also experience these sense of insecurities in our work and in other parts of our life, right? So I think, for me, one of the things that I enjoyed the most was I think Eliza was talking about women's confidence and how like our society has this obsession with monitoring women's confidence, where we essentially bring women up just to like knock them back down. And I think there are so many elements of a woman's life. Like if it's not your looks, it's going to be something at your job that you're going to have to feel bad about, or you're going to be mommy shamed because you're not like parenting your kid correctly. And I just think it sort of serves to show that like there is this very big gap, I think, between some of the things that women have to be confronted with and deal with versus men.
Yeah, I almost wonder how much of that is like self-inflicted versus like external, because it's one of those things where like, yeah, there's like sort of like the joke that like the comedian said, which is like, yeah, it's generally just comically true. Just like when she's just like what does a guy see when she looks to the mirror, and he's just like, it could be like, Ebenezer Scrooge just being like, oh, I'm hot sort of thing. It's like one of those things where it's like, it's funny because there's like the comedic side of it, which is exactly that. But then there's like the sad part of like, all the men who are like dealing with like depression and suicidal thoughts and all these types of things. And like, there's like zero sympathy from society to like do anything to help men. Whereas you were saying, not too long ago that like there are like dozens upon dozens upon dozens of like groups if like a woman is feeling this or that or the other. So it's sort of just like, this crazy sort of mental health sort of trade-off. But then when I do look at a lot of the things that like sort of they were saying and then kind of taking it to like society at large, it's almost like I wonder sometimes in the same way that like, there will be a guy, whether it's like, oh, it's a LeBron James or it's Tom Cruise or it's like this person or that person that like will say inspire a guy to be like, oh, okay, like I should start like working out if I want like those abs. Shout out to like Will Smith's dad bod that he kind of put on Instagram or whatever lately. But it's just like, there's this, okay, like I have to take control of my life if I want to achieve certain things. And then like kind of wonder why that message seems to be incapable of taking root from like a mass level on like the female side. Because like when you look at society and like it's media and it's all these things, I get the whole like sex sells and like this and this and like, we need the like blonde musician, and even like Billie Eilish, which like I kind of saw like I guess her photo shoot and I kind of like raised an eyebrow and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't like dive too deep into like the headlines of that to kind of fully understand what she's trying to do. But it was like one of these things where I'm like, it feels self-inflicted sometimes. It's definitely not to deny any external factors, but it seems like some of this is being prolonged purely on like the personal level, not the like, can people achieve promotions and all that kind of stuff. There's definitely kind of very real barriers there, but almost this sort of like me against me issue that seems to be, again, like self-inflicted. And like with comedians, there's like this amazing thing, this gift that they have to sort of like work that out publicly, like Marina Franklin, who had her sort of breast cancer scare, and kind of she was able to kind of like, okay, I can go and like process this in front of an audience in like in some ways, like the one woman that she spoke to right before she went up on stage, and she was like, most people have to just bottle that up and just keep it and like it'll just erode at him, but like she had the ability to kind of go out and like work it out in public sort of thing. But yeah, it's interesting to kind of hear. It feels self-inflicted, but then of course, seeing these people, as I just said, they kind of just get to work it out through the material.
Yeah, I mean, like I think again, like I hear you, but like the Billie Eilish thing is actually a really interesting example for me of like why it's not self-inflicted, and that is, she talked about this, I think, a couple of years ago, just that, like, most people obviously are not aware, but she has very, large breasts, right? And I think, again, like, that's something I can kind of relate to, because I've spent years trying to hide that, like, in the workplace. And like, then when people do kind of find out, they comment about it, which makes it more awkward. Like, that like some sort of secret has come out. And so she had this interview a couple of years ago where she was talking about that, that she knows that there is a time where she will want to sort of dress a certain way. I think she's obviously been underage, but that, she's becoming a young woman. But this consciousness of sort of, how the media is going to react when that happens. And so I think, the photo shoot you referenced is kind of what that was. I think that was finally her kind of coming out and really for the first time showing her body, because I think, as she often wears very baggy clothes in all of her performances and public appearances. And so I think, like, again, like, to me, that isn't really self-inflicted. It's self-inflicted in the sense of, like, she's having to be calculated about how much she shows of herself. But I think, if anything, it's more of a consciousness, again, of the fact that her whole career will change after that moment, right? And I think I was really stunned a couple of years ago to hear such a young woman talk about that, right? And have that have to be something that she has to factor into her own career trajectory, that she will likely lose fans as a result of it, that her fan base will change as a result of it, that the commentary around her and the way that she'll start to be written about in the media will change. And she's not wrong. I think, like, for a lot of probably even like parents now, they're going to look at that cover shoot and think twice maybe now about bringing their young daughter to see Billie Eilish. Right. But, the reality is like, there's such a fine, like, gap at this point, I think, for women in this society between girls and being women, right? That I think that that's something you're always going to see, like, young acts like Billie Eilish having to, like, walk that a little bit. So yeah, I just, again, like, I don't really think it's so much self-inflicted. I do think it's sort of the mirroring of what we see in society. And I think that these are real factors that, not just famous women have to confront.
Yeah, along those lines, I thought it was actually pretty enlightening, but perhaps I forgot what context this was, but it was like some talking to a friend of mine or something like that about, like, sometimes it actually doesn't really have anything with, like, gender, race, religion, politics, or whatever. Sometimes people just don't like you. And, like, I was thinking about that when during the Kathy Griffin segment, when they were talking about when they showed, like, the Trump head sort of thing. And it was really interesting because, like, I remember that happening and trending and such. And I was kind of like, yeah, I can see why she's getting sort of blowback by it, because it is sort of like it is kind of like an extreme sort of thing. And then when they were showing sort of the press conference, and then they kind of highlighted, oh, well, there's these other bands, and there's this, and there's, like, kind of the other thing. It was kind of, like, fascinating to see, because I was like, yeah, I guess this is kind of like one of those, like, is this happening because she's a woman, or is this happening because people just don't like her? And it's one of those things, like, when you're a comedian, and, like, same thing with, like, actors and really just anyone, like, any artist, like, it's kind of like one of those things where, like, you've heard me say this, where I go, yeah, I respect it. I was like, it's not for me, but I was just like, I understand, like, what that person is doing is difficult, and, like, I applaud that, but I was just like, I don't need to consume it, and, like, kind of what they do. And I just wonder if that blew up, because I've not known firsthand anyone who's, like, really enjoyed Kathy Griffin. She's been around for forever, and I remember seeing her on, like, TV and all that kind of stuff. And so, like, in my mind, she is kind of, like, of that ilk of, like, the Joan Rivers and, like, those people that were kind of the elders, if you will. And I kind of was like, oh yeah, like, she's like a godmother of, like, the industry, but, like, I just never personally sort of found her funny, but, like, I get it, sort of thing. And then when you saw the stuff, like, the band where it was like, Trump was, like, cut in half and, like, spewing blood, and, like, some of the other stuff, I was like, yeah, I was like, is this on the same wavelength? Like, was this like a platform thing or whatever? And so I just found that fascinating. I don't really have a conclusion to that. It was just interesting to see that, like, those are the examples that were being brought forth, and they were equally as, like, gruesome and sort of graphic, but it was kind of like, yeah, I don't know if this is just one of those things where it was like, okay, someone who we we were looking for an excuse to kind of like kick down a peg, made that mistake, and now everyone's sort of jumping on her versus, okay, we're coming after you because you're a woman, sort of thing.
Yeah, but I mean, I think again, the distinction there is that there are not as many examples in our society of people that actually want to kick men down a peg, even when they're disliked, right? I think like you can think about like, we have disliked celebrities. What happened to Kathy Griffin, having like this huge uproar, having her career, having her ability to make an income, jeopardized essentially for this act. We have men that actually like commit crimes and don't necessarily face those sort of repercussions, right? Like Shia LaBeouf right now is a perfect example of like, you could say maybe like a hated celebrity, and he sort of continues to like operate in the world, even though this is what happened. So I think that was sort of the distinction that like even Margaret Cho was trying to make with some of her commentary on the Kathy Griffin thing, is just sort of like, when you look out to see what happens to men with similar behavior, like the response is not the same. And that women are sort of held to this very, very different standard than men that are doing things that are either similar or in a lot of instances, much worse. Because Kathy Griffin did not actually commit a crime or rape someone or sexually assault someone or something like that. She took a photo, right? And I think that to me is more kind of what they were trying to say, is like, it's just a different response in society to the way a hated man is treated versus a hated woman.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, especially like when you consider the conclusion of what the lengths that everyone was ended up going to because of a hated man versus her, who is now kind of back making money and doing her things. And he is not. But it's also just interesting because it's one of those things where it's like I think with some of the examples that like Nevins shows in the documentary that I kind of thought were like, see now this is the snake kind of eating its own tail sort of situation, when like she was talking about like other female or other male comedians also, publicly kind of like disparage sort of like women. And they show the Howard Stern clip that was 100% fair. Cause that's just like, Norm Macdonald, like that's them on a talk show kind of just like, having their opinion. And that has weight, with just the audience, the platform and such. But then when it showed Chris Rock and some of the other people who were like on stage kind of in their act, I was like, I don't know that I would count that, because that's one of those things that's really about the profession in general right now, in the way that like, I remember when, you remember when like Eminem had his like cypher thing for like BET, and then he has like that joke later on where he was like, oh, the Secret Service actually like showed up because they were like, yo, like, are you actually threatening the president of the United States kind of thing? And he was like, no, they were just lyrics. And so it's one of those things where like, I don't know. I think her point is definitely like sound. Like, I definitely think that there are other male comedians out there who look at their female counterparts and are just like, yeah, I don't know what you guys are doing. Like, it's just like full on sexism, whatever. I think there are people who just like don't care. And then I think there are people who are just like, oh, hey, like good set kind of thing. Just like good game kind of whatever. But I think it's sort of like dangerous to be like, oh, and then this person in their act is sort of rewarded for that or is able to sort of do that. And then when women try to do it, we can't. And it's kind of one of those things where I think I've even told you, like, I was like, stop trying to outman a man, out human a human, like be the best kind of thing. And I think even Marina Franklin said that, where she was like, don't let being a woman hold you back. Don't let being black hold you back. Just like get out there and like be funny kind of thing. And like, that's the kind of thing that I was kind of getting at too, about like the self-inflicted sort of stuff, where it's like, if people kind of get too in their head about, oh, well, of course I can't succeed because I'm a this and I'm a this and I'm a this and I'm a this, then it kind of is like, yeah, then you won't, because it's not like anyone's like celebrating those things either. It's kind of just like, you've opted into this sort of negative assault on your self-esteem, which, to exactly your point, could come from any number of sort of areas, but it's like, don't let them live rent-free in your head kind of thing. But yeah, it was just, it's it was interesting that she chose those sort of examples, because I do think that in the confines of someone on stage, I think it's just a very different arena than them giving an interview and kind of saying some crazy stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my mind, it's still kind of like two different things though, right? Like, I mean, I agree with you that I think, you know, for women, it is better to kind of take the approach that a lot of those women did of like, you know, I'm not going to be held back. I'm not going to, you know, let being a woman sort of affect my ability to be successful. And, you know, so I agree with that. But I think there's sort of a separate track that you're touching upon, which is more, and they talked about this a lot in the documentary, this concept of how like women are actually allowed to be in society, right? And I think that's more what the Kathy Griffin thing gets at, is that like she was not allowed to be as shocking as other men have been in regards to talking about the president, right? And I think like they touch on this quite a bit in terms of some of the sections where they address women's anger and rage and how that then gets perceived in society. And I think even the Chris Rock bit was brought up kind of to show just that, you know, male comedians kind of forever have been able to be angry and rage filled on stage, and the audience finds that funny, that women are walking, you know, kind of a tightrope in terms of how that's going to be perceived, right? And I think that was also really relatable, because that's not something I think that just exists for female comedians. That exists for all women in the workplace everywhere, right? Of if you are sort of, you know, assertive, or if you speak in a certain way, or if you carry yourself in a certain way, or if you command space and time and energy, it very easily can suddenly be misconstrued as, you know, you're a bitch, or, you know, any other number of labels that are assigned to women. So to me, I sort of see them as, you know, two separate things. And I do think that, again, women are sort of held to a different standard in terms of how we're allowed to express our emotions. You know, and I think that, you know, to your point, like, yes, you know, women can sort of be the best and persevere in that way. But I do think women struggle to be their true authentic selves and still be successful. I don't think that we are sometimes allowed the space to sort of behave and act in the way that men are, you know, without it having some sort of repercussion, right? And I think, you know, this spills over even into like personal lives, right? You know, like anyone that is dating and talks about like a woman that might get overly passionate or something like that can be a real turnoff for men a lot of times, right? And I think that is sort of, again, whether it is in personal spaces or in professional spaces, men have more license, I think, to be kind of in any sort of mood and act any sort of way. And I think women have to be much more conscious of how that is going to appear and be perceived, and how that will affect, you know, their ability to be successful in those situations.
Yeah, it's interesting, because it's one of those where, like, I understand that, but I also just think it feels self-inflicted. Like, it kind of just, it's like one of those things where, like, if you were someone who was like, okay, I want to go play a pickup basketball game in my neighborhood, but I know that I have a bad knee, and then I go and then I'm playing and then I'm losing, and then kind of saying, hey, you guys need to sort of accommodate me for having a bad knee. Like, that's not like a perfect example, but like that's sometimes how it kind of seems, as opposed to these stories that you hear of like people who go to the Olympics and people who do these like tremendous things where it's like, you know, like the people who can run just as fast, if not faster, or break records with like a prosthetic leg, or like someone who's got like, you know, the people who have had like 6 heart surgeries and ended up like running and winning like an Olympic race kind of thing. It just, to me, comes off sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes as like, this is a struggle that I choose to just, it's easier for me to be a part of the struggle than it is for me to like overcome the struggle. Like, there's comfort in being amongst the tribe of like the quote unquote oppressed than it is to be the person who's like, oh, okay, like I'm going to go out there and like change it or like do it kind of thing. And obviously like that's not for everyone. Everyone's not supposed to be the, you know, Joan of Arc or, you know, King Leonidas. Like I get that, but I do think there's like a lot of, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying before of just like, I wonder who then is out there that is sort of like, I don't know, I guess I want to say universally like accepted as like a female kind of like role model, if you will. Like it's like the little girls look up to them, maybe older women look up to them. Because it's like for guys, I do think they kind of, there's a lot of, it's either, most of the time it's probably like some sort of athlete, or, you know, maybe it's a movie star, or maybe it's sort of this, and they'll kind of like look at that person and kind of like figure out, almost like reverse engineer that lifestyle. But then when I see like the sort of female counterpart to that, I would just be very curious to know who is kind of looked up to from like an aspirational angle instead of sort of looked down on because maybe like they're a nerd, or like, oh, well, of course they're able to do this because they're rich, or of course they're able to do this. Like this, there's almost like sort of like a lot of bifurcation. I don't think that was really kind of like present in like the documentary. And this is more just like a broad sort of observation, kind of like the train of thought that we're currently on, because I think like, as it applies to the documentary, I think all of them feel like they're making progress, and all of them had that like, I'm terrified but I'm going to take one step closer kind of thing. Like it's like, I'm afraid of heights but I'm still going to go out on the ledge and like dance out here kind of thing, which is why they're all, for the most part, I think still kind of on the rise. But I just wonder how many women are being held back again by just things that are in their head versus things that, okay, now that I kind of understand how to play chess, let me make my move, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't disagree with you that I think there's like people that exploit like their victimhood, but I still think that there are just these realities of kind of like how women do get perceived. Like, I mean, I think like using as an example, like any company, you know, you have a new executive start and it's a woman. If she is confident and assertive and, you know, comes in and knows what she wants to do, both men and women usually will start to speculate things like, and I know this because I've been there when these types of things have gone on, of like, oh, is she going to be a bitch? Is she going to be nice? Is she, you know, like how she's going to be interpersonally is almost immediately called into question. And I don't think that is the case for men, right? If a male executive starts at a company and he's confident and assertive, we don't use those words. We don't have those phrases to start associating with how he might conduct himself interpersonally. And so I think that's all kind of, they're really trying to highlight in parts of the documentary, is just sort of this different kind of standard, I think, that women are held to, and how that in a lot of ways further perpetuates the rage that we do have inside of us. But that how obviously a lot of these women have been able to use comedy as an outlet for that.
Yeah, I think the one woman, I'm going to click around here. I actually think that this is probably not her. I was going to say, no, it's not her. But the woman who went viral, I think, what was interesting, viral for the Harvey Weinstein thing, I think what was interesting about that is hearing her say, like, okay, I know I've put myself out there and there's really no coming back from this. And like, I have to sort of keep my composure and sort of keep going. Like, that's what I'm getting at. Like, it's like, I legit think, I don't think, this kind of like to go back to the Kathy Griffin example, I don't think necessarily what she was saying, and I don't think she was intending to be like, you know, to like thread this needle of satire and like the most sort of like cerebral joke while also calling sort of the people in the room out sort of thing. I don't think she was trying to do that at all. I think this is just sort of like okay, like I'm up here and I've got the mic and like, therefore you sort of have to listen to me say these things. But like, I do think that like, why I think that's cool is it's like, oh, and you know, I've talked to you about this. We talked a lot about this during sort of that, when the Me Too stuff was happening. It was like the people who will face sort of certain destruction or just what they assume will be destruction, those people I will always respect, because it's not just them saying, oh, well, I would have, or, oh, I'm confident, or, oh, I have the ability to do this, or, oh, blah, 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 but I can't because this, and I can't because this, and I can't because this. I was like, cool. Even no matter what happens to that person, I'll respect them for having like, yeah, I said something, and like, I don't know what's going to happen to me next, but like, I can kind of go to sleep tonight knowing that like I said my piece and all that kind of stuff. Like it's out there kind of thing. Because like the one thing that I wanted to also get to is sort of like the almost like the pay disparity that they were talking about, specifically with Netflix, when sort of they were talking about with like Wanda Sykes and some of those folks, because it's sort of one of those things where like I remember even when sort of that occurred, and like it was one of those things that kind of sort of like how we started this, where I was like, man, like who is the like A-list female comedian? I don't remember what Amy Schumer got. And she wasn't really present. She was sort of, they had like cut together interviews for her in this. But it was one of those things where when I was thinking like, if you're comparing yourself to Dave Chappelle, like, I don't know how to like equate that, if that makes sense. Like, that's kind of one of those things where like, I'm sure Dave Chappelle and Kevin Hart get ridiculous money. And then it's like Hannibal Buress is like, I enjoy him, but it's just a name I'm thinking of pulling out of a hat. It's probably like much further down, and I don't know what he would get as opposed to some of the women here. But like Eliza Schlesinger, as you said, like we've watched a couple of her things. I actually think she's really funny, and she's probably going to end up climbing and doing quite well. Nikki Glasser, I think we've seen do recent stuff as well. Yeah, it's just it's an interesting thing to watch these women kind of traverse it all, and then to think they did it for the most part just because they love comedy that much. And then to think of all the people who say that they love accounting, marketing, this and this and this and this, and then kind of are just discouraged out of it. It's an interesting, just sort of like, it's a psychology thing. It's like, I almost don't generally look at things as like the tribal label. I look at it more from the psychology angle, but it's just an interesting sort of psychology to sort of think about like what's happening here, that like we don't have more people making that mental leap to just sort of be like, okay, like I'm risking complete and utter destruction, whether that's financial or that's just personal reputation or blah, 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 blah. But like, I'm right here, so I'm going to go for it.
Yeah. I mean, again, my response to that though is probably just, I think it's harder for women to take risks too. It's, again, I just think like structurally we're not given as much license to do that. But it's not always a bad thing. There was a really big study that just came out about what happens to organizations when women are at the helm. And it actually, the reason I thought the study was really fascinating was because it wasn't necessarily trying to say, definitively, oh, companies are better off with women at the helm, right? Like it wasn't looking to make any sort of assumptions. It was just more trying to reveal what happens to an organization, right? Objectively. And one of the things, their top findings is that organizations become risk averse. And what that does, to a company's long-term trajectory, right? There could be a lot of benefits to taking less risks, right? And then also the ways in which women then change the organization to become more collaborative and innovative instead of, taking more outside risks. So I think, in some ways, some of the things that are either very, natural or either that we are conditioned to, they can have positive sides to them for sure. But again, I think there's just this tension point between sort of what women are able to do and what men are able to do. I think one of the things sort of related to what you were saying that I found really interesting and that I was kind of happy they highlighted was really just this idea in general, like comedians, both male and female, as sort of the modern day philosophers, or I think as Eliza said, whistleblowers in a sense.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that they kind of took the time to sort of address that from these women's point of view, right? Just in terms of like, you know, you and I talk about this so much, but like our society has become very PC. And I think, you know, with cancel culture and things like that, we're definitely living now more than ever, certainly in both of our lifetimes, right? In an environment where the things that you say and do can get you into quite a bit of trouble, right? I mean, we're seeing just average people losing their jobs because of things that, you know, people think they've done, or, you know, just the ability for someone that even might have a vendetta against you for some random reason to kind of take you down digitally, right? Like this is happening kind of all around us, I think, on like a much sort of larger scale right now. And I think it was just sort of interesting, this concept that, because I do agree with this wholeheartedly, actually, that comedians are sort of the last protected class in a sense that gets to do this. And as in, you know, shown with Kathy Griffin and Trump, even they don't necessarily always get to do this, right? But I do think that when I think about, okay, who actually in our society gets to kind of just call it like it is, really comedians are what come to mind. And so I think that part was cool as well, is like, there's this element of like, yes, you know, we need to get more women into comedy, but just also one thing I think that would have been interesting for them to explore is just the general state of comedy, right? And like how we've started to see stand-up comedians get, you know, larger movie parts, or become like, you know, actors full-time and things like that. I think it's a really important art. And I thought that was an interesting part of the documentary that I wish they would have maybe explored just a little bit more. I think we need comedians in a big way, especially in times like these.
Yeah, I mean, I think unless sort of the distinction I was making earlier about how Nevins kind of was, you know, spliced in the Chris Rock sort of stuff versus like the Norm Macdonald on the Howard Stern show, like, I think unless we as a society can watch a stand-up comic, be offended, and then go on about our lives, I think it's like an art form that like we're not going to see a lot of new people get into, because I think the risk is going to be too great, and the amount of time it takes to work through the proper material is like too long. And so like someone is more likely to be canceled or removed before they ever kind of reach that point where they know how to phrase this sort of stuff. Like if you've seen some of the you know, the Netflix stuff, but you've, you know, obviously seen like Chappelle and like Chris Rock and some of these other people, and like they say stuff that like if you were to lift like any two lines, any two sentences out of their acts would probably be, you know, you would have the whole cancel mob just like knocking at their door. But like when you hear them in full context and you kind of understand their train of thought and you see where they're going with it, and then they kind of say the like the scary line or the scary thing, that's crafted over who knows how long, how many times they had to be in front of an audience to like get that, to like make the cadence and have that like in like, you know, just everything land exactly right with the timing and the perfect, exactly like Eliza said, where it's like a melody where you're kind of composing sort of the audience kind of thing. And like, I don't know that people now, like if you're like a high school, college kid, especially that's like not telling just sort of knock jokes, like if you're trying to sort of take a look at like, hey, like I have things to say about politics or things to say about gender relations or race relations or whatever, like that person is more likely to be, you know, destroyed from like a reputational standpoint than they are to ever, you know, spend the 20, 30 years getting to, you know, Dave Chappelle status kind of thing. And I think that's kind of it's an interesting thing to think about, because I agree like what she was saying. And like, I've heard a lot of other sort of comedians talk about that, like, that's what they're there to do. Like they're given the microphone to kind of observe and kind of report back on the things that they see in society. And all sorts of comedians, you know, the ones that do stupid things about food, but then like politics and this and that or the other. It feels like that's going to go away, especially when you hear people talking about the stuff like at colleges, where colleges will kind of do a little bit of digging and find out that you made like a joke on YouTube like 10 years ago. And they're just like, actually, we're not going to have you here because you don't represent our values, blah, blah, blah. Instead of just having people just not show up, or again, just sort of take the joke and move on. But yeah, I think all that's going to be really fascinating to see how that moves forward, especially now that I guess things politically are starting to cool off. If we'll see PC culture sort of also wane, or if it's kind of here to stay for a little bit.
For sure.
Any last thoughts on Hysterical, the female comedians, the sort of the jokes, any of that stuff?
No, I think, I definitely would say that in light of the conversation we've been having, I think both men and women would enjoy this documentary. I did think it was cool just that they actually provided little bits and pieces of all of these comic stand-up acts. I think that was a really great way of just getting to know each of them a little bit more. I, like you, I think was familiar with all of them. Like I probably couldn't pick them out of the lineup and tell you their name, but realize that more or less, I think I've seen all of them on TV or, parts of their act before. And so I think that kept the pace of the documentary moving in a really nice way. Just that you could kind of get a sense for each of their, style and the things that they were talking about on stage and weren't talking about. And they were all sort of unique too, which I think was another kind of cool thing that sort of helped to illustrate the silliness that they were talking about in terms of these clubs that won't put on more than one woman a night, right? As if there's only one opportunity to talk about things that women might want to talk about, right? Or even just this concept that men won't find it funny, right? I appreciated that too, sort of the walkthrough of female comics, watching men slowly unwind themselves into being ready to enjoy their act and actually think that they're funny. I think we have seen that with Amy Schumer and some of these bigger acts that, they can appeal to all audiences. And I think this documentary does that as well. So definitely a big thumbs up for me. I think people will enjoy it. I think it's lighthearted, but I also think it helps to sort of reveal the challenges that these women face and, will likely continue to face. My only one thing that I have to just call out, because it did sort of not upset me, I just thought it was weird, but having Sherry Shepherd in the movie talking about not sleeping with male comics, while I knew why she was saying it and I agree with the advice, I just thought that was the weirdest note in the documentary on. I think it's something a couple of the other female comics loosely alluded to throughout it, but it definitely was not a core subject matter of the documentary. And so as a woman, just having to end it talking about sleeping with men just struck me as really odd. So that's my only pet peeve. Outside of that, go watch this film.
Nope, they're just trying to make sure if you were getting ready to become a stand-up comedian that you didn't break the golden rule, and that was one of the golden rules.
I get that. Just sandwich that somewhere else in the movie, I don't know, just kind of a weird last thing. But and then actually more of a question, something I'm intrigued by. It felt like a lot of those comics wrote their sort of ending notes. I think, a lot of times, at the end of the movie, if it's a, biographical film or something, there'll be a note about, where the person currently is, in life. But I thought they all kind of read as different interpretations of that, if that makes sense. So I was really curious to know, if the comics personally wrote those or if that was something that, the documentarian wrote. So more of just a curiosity.
That felt like a documentarian thing, because it almost didn't seem like it was needed, because all of these comedians are active. This would have been one of those things if you were doing a documentary on comedians in the 80s or 90s, and then you're watching all the footage and blah 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 blah, and then it's so and so went on to to your point, be an actor, so and so teaches at such and such, so and so does a podcast. It was kind of it was fine. It was probably actually more truthfully it was probably more of a backdoor way of being oh, what was that woman's name again? And then it was a clean way of being oh, this is who she is, in case you want to go Google her and now go watch some of her specials or catch up with her, blah blah blah. type of thing.
Yeah, I just thought it was more weird. Like some of them were status updates on their lives, and then some of them were more just like jokes. So that's why I was curious.
Yeah, it's weird superlatives. I'd recommend this as well. Very similar to our past premiere episode, listeners, where Fake Famous was sort of a nice high-level introduction to the world of influencers. I thought this was a really nice high-level introduction to the path of a stand-up comedian, and then I would say with a bonus that it then happened to also dive into the layers of issues that female comedians have to deal with in particular. So I thought it was cool to that regard, and I'm glad that it was not as heavy-handed or preachy as I was concerned about when I sat down to watch it. I was sort of happily surprised that I feel like I have a little bit more insight into the profession and even sort of the history, which I wasn't expecting to kind of get from this at all, as well. It was cool to see some black and white footage of those folks doing it, which that was a really actually difficult to do. Again, not to belittle sort of some of the stories that we were hearing in this documentary, but I can only imagine being in the 50s and 60s and dealing with the stuff that they were dealing with, and then finding the way to get front and center and to basically lead your entire profession forward decades ago. So that was pretty cool to see.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, fellow feathers in arms, that is episode 2. As we mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard, help us keep it going by supporting us at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a patron of one of our many tiers, starting as low as $1. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. And before we exit, to tease next week's episode, Nicole Matthews, I'm going to ask you a very particular question off the cuff, on the spot. Do you believe in Bigfoot?
Oh, I don't know. I go back and forth. Some periods in my life, yes. Some periods in my life, no. How about that?
Right. Well, we'll leave it at that.
But I am a dreamer, so I do love shit like that. So I will say, the possibility of Bigfoot excites me. All
right. We'll leave it at that. It's a teaser for episode 3, listeners. We'll be diving into the world of Bigfoot for our next documentary. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, listeners. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. She is Nicole Matthews, and you can follow her where?
You can follow me on Twitter at Nicole Matthews, and you can follow me on Instagram at Marie Coley, Colie.
And I'm Brandan Jones. You can follow me at Lamar Diablo, one word, on Twitter. And these are the rabbit holes that quack. Good night.